How much do you know about Japan, the land of the rising sun? Before our story actually begins, some geographic and historical information would be helpful. There are 4 major Japanese islands: Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido. This story takes place on Japan's second largest island, and perhaps most primitive, Hokkaido, which is located north of Honshu, Japan's most productive island. The indigenous people of Hokkaido were not Japanese, but a race of people called the Ainu, who survived by hunting, fishing, and subsistence farming. The Japanese actually came to Hokkaido in 1615 and quickly subdued the Ainu, placing most of them on reservations similar to those established for Native Americans in the United States. Surviving on Hokkaido was indeed a struggle for all those who lived there. Even today, there are a few major cities outside of Sapporo, the island's capital. The land is rugged with several mountain ranges crisscrossing the island, making travel difficult. And with harsh winter temperatures and excessive amounts of snowfall, many of the inhabitants face long periods of isolation throughout the year. Religion is another important aspect of Japanese life. Most citizens of Japan follow either the Buddhist or the Shinto religion. In fact, there is a Japanese expression that stresses the view that most Japanese are born into the Buddhist faith, but die in the Shinto tradition. However, sometime around 1549, Christianity was introduced to the people of Japan by the missionary Francis Xavier. Slowly, Christianity gained a tenuous foothold in Japan, and this is where our story begins. In the 1900s, Protestant missionaries established many small but faithful churches on the island of Hokkaido. One of these outpost churches was located in a secluded valley at the base of the Ishikari Mountains. This mountain range was so difficult to navigate that it almost divided the island into 2 segments. The tiny church was so small and blended into its surrounding environment so well that most people didn't even know that it existed. The congregation was so small that they could not afford to hire a pastor. Instead, members of the congregation took turns leading the Sunday service. The most beloved member of the group was a widow named Oba-san, meaning grandmother or older woman. Nobody in the church knew her age or how long she had served others in need. In fact, no one could remember a time when she was not there. On a cold December day, Oba-san was sitting by the fire in her tiny cabin, thinking about nothing in particular, when there was a loud knocking on her door. Slowly, she rose from her chair and made her way to the door to see who was making all the racket. To her surprise, it was not one person, but a group of parishioners from the church, all with tears freezing on their cheeks. Entering the cabin, they all began to speak at the same time. Finally, one of the members of the group was able to quiet the others and explain to Oba-san what had happened. During the night, a group of bandits broke into the church, stealing everything of value and vandalizing what they could not carry away. Most of what they took or destroyed could be replaced. But the most precious item in the church was a cross, which a missionary that had served the community had given to them. It was not large, perhaps a foot tall, with a cross piece being 8 inches in length, and had served as a centerpiece of their weekly services for more than anyone could remember. Made out of pottery by some of the most gifted potters on the islands of Honshu, it was now a pile of shards, seemingly impossible to repair. With Christmas coming in just 2 weeks, what could be done to replace this irreplaceable item? Christmas would just not be the same for this tiny Christian congregation. Oba-san put on her thinking cap and came up with a plan that just might save Christmas. It was dangerous for her, but perhaps her faith could make it work. She explained to the group crowded into her cabin what she was thinking. Oba-san said, "We live in Japan and our people practice many different arts and crafts, such as ikebana, the art of flower arranging, bunraku, meaning puppet theater, and origami, which is the skill of paper folding. However, the skill that might solve our problem is called kintsugi, meaning to join with gold. A shisho, or master craftsman, can take pieces of broken pottery and restore them to their original condition using liquid gold to hold them together. It is my understanding that the most renowned kintsugi master lives in a small cabin high in the Ishikari Mountains. The problem is the home of this Kinsari master can only be reached by foot on treacherous trails, which at this time of year are covered with ice and snow. Oba-san said she was willing to attempt to bring the broken cross to this Kintsugi master, hopefully convincing him to repair it and return home in time for Christmas. At first, the group uproariously said no. The journey would be too difficult and dangerous for her to try alone. Slowly, in a very persuasive voice, she managed to sway the crowd to accept her proposal. Kneeling around the fire in her small home, she told the group that when she was a teenager, and against her parents' wishes, she spent much of her free time exploring the Ishikari Mountains, becoming very familiar with the terrain. Secondly, going alone would be much quicker than an entire expedition of people trying to ascend the Ishikari. Finally, all of the other members of the community had families to care for, while she had only herself to worry about. Well, bright and early the next day, Oba-san was ready to begin her quest for the Kintsugi master's cabin high in the Ishikari Mountains. What the church members did not know was that God, knowing Oba-san's strong faith and determination, had appointed a very unusual being to protect and guide her on her journey. His name was Adashari, meaning tiny, and he was the last Japanese gnome on Hokkaido. In fact, he was the last surviving gnome in all of Japan. Dressed in her warmest winter clothing and carrying 2 sacks, one with food for the quest and the other containing the shards of the broken cross, she began her trek. Oba-san bent over from age, and the burdens of her 2 sacks and her burdens she had slung over her shoulders, stepped out of her cozy home, and could only wonder what this unique adventure would end. The only other item she carried was a walking stick to help her trudge through the snow and to help her maintain her balance on treacherous trails she was pursuing. Secretly, Adashari, her guardian gnome, was carefully watching her every movement, trying to ensure that the adventure she had undertaken would be successful, and she would return to her fellow congregants in time for Christmas. Adashari did not look anything like the gnomes which we are familiar. On his feet, he did not wear shoes, but instead wooden Japanese sandals called geta, which really were similar to flip-flops. His shirt and shorts were made from moleskin, and his chest was covered with a breastplate made from slivers of bamboo hardened with a lacquer made from beetle saliva. His outfit was completed with a war hat called a ginzaga, which appeared to be an upside-down bowl made from straw, which almost covered his entire face. Adashari's eyes were bright, his cheeks were red, his nose was bulbous, but his most noticeable physical attribute were his tiny, knotty knees. This is the person that God selected to guide and protect Oba-san from any misadventures she might encounter on her journey to the Kintsugi master's cabin. What was he thinking? With only 6 days until Christmas Eve, it appeared that Oba-san's search for the Kintsugi master's cabin would be futile. And if she did manage to locate the home of the master, would he repair the cross, or was it so badly damaged that there was no possible way, even with his skills, that he could restore it to a semblance of its past beauty? Furthermore, Oba-san was sure she did not have the necessary funds to pay the master for his efforts. Slowly, Oba-san climbed the Ishikari slopes until she saw smoke rising from a chimney in a tiny cabin high above her. Exhausted but determined, using all of her willpower, she managed the final ascent to her goal. Little did she know that for the entire journey, Adashari had been guiding her in the proper direction. He used every trick he had to make her turn to the right, in the right direction. Sometimes a howling wind would push her to the left or to the right. Sudden snowstorms would cause her to veer in a different direction. Fallen logs and huge boulders would cause her to change her course. All of these obstacles and many others were placed in her path by Adashari so that she could reach the Kintsugi's master's cabin successfully. After knocking on the door of the cabin, a grumpy little man appeared, and by his appearance, she was sure her quest would be in vain, and she would have to return to her village with a sack of shards. Surprisingly, after listening to her tale, he agreed to examine the segments of the cross and to use his best skills to repair it with liquid gold. Taking a bag of shards, he entered his workshop and began the process of repairing the cross. After hours of banging and clanging and much cursing, the master came to Oba-san with a marvelous item in his hands. Of course, it was the repaired cross, which was even more beautiful than before, with the shiny gold cementing the fragments of the cross together. Oba-san was astonished at the results of his efforts. Before she could meekly ask how much the repairs would cost, the master shouted out something she did not expect. Oba-san, this is perhaps my greatest challenge, and I consider it to be my masterpiece. That, plus your determination and faith, have convinced me not to change anything, not to charge anything for the repairs. Thanking him profusely, Oba-san prepared for the return journey to her small church at the foot of the Ishikari Mountains. Little Adashari was also prepared to guide her home safely. Halfway down the mountains, Oba-san came to a hot spring, which was the home of the famous, or sometimes infamous, snow monkeys of Hokkaido. Snow monkeys are extremely curious and very mischievous. When they saw the sack that Oba-san carried, they immediately wanted to know what was in it. Perhaps something good to eat. Working together, one of the monkeys distracted Oba-san, while another monkey grabbed the sack, jumped back into the hot springs, and hung the sack from a branch hanging over the center of the pool of water. Oba-san was destroyed. How was she ever going to get the cross away from the monkeys? Hidden from view, Adashari had an idea that might save the day. Like gnomes everywhere, Adashari had the ability to communicate with animals living in his environment. One of his best friends in the animal kingdom was Pikachu, a red-crowned crane. Together, they hatched the plan to retrieve the cross from the snow monkeys. Adashari took several stones and threw them into the woods some distance from the monkeys. Hearing the noise of the stones crashing to the ground, the monkeys, being curious, all left the hot springs to see what had caused the commotion. As soon as the monkeys were out of sight, Pikachu swooped down, grabbed the hanging bag from the branch, and gently placed it at the feet of Oba-san. Not knowing how all this came about, but being extremely grateful, she quickly hoisted the bag onto her shoulder. Before the monkeys realized that they had been tricked, Oba-san was too far away for them to follow. Adashari, pleased with this deception, rolled on the ground laughing, thinking how silly it was of the snow monkeys to fall for such a simple trick. It was now Christmas Eve, but Oba-san was not sure she could finish the trip down the mountain in time to restore the cross to its resting place behind the communion table. Exhausted, Oba-san sat on a fallen log to rest. Suddenly, she thought she heard voices in the distance. Listening more intently, she was positive she could hear sounds of people approaching. What Oba-san did not know was that she had become disoriented, and she was actually closer to home than she had realized. The villagers had established a search party in the hopes of finding Oba-san coming down the slopes of the Ishikari Mountains. Once again, it was Adashari to the rescue. He caused Oba-san to sing her favorite Christmas hymn, Silent Night. Hearing the song, the search party headed in the direction of the song. There she was, sitting on a fallen log, singing her heart out. The crowd quickly surrounded her, put her on their shoulders, and carried her the rest of the way to the village. After a much-needed rest, Oba-san felt strangely refreshed. It was Christmas Eve, and there was nothing that was going to prevent her from attending the evening service. Oba-san, carrying her sack, was the last person to arrive. She marched to the front of the church, circled behind the communion table, and to the delight and the amazement of the congregants, placed the cherished cross in its place of honor. Now, it was a tradition in this tiny church to hold a tea ceremony after the service. Of course, Oba-san was the center of attention, while she told everyone of her adventures. Awestruck, everyone marveled at her faith and determination. At the conclusion of the tea ceremony, a cup of tea was always placed on the communion table. It was assumed that the essence of the tea would reach God, and he would be pleased with their devotion. The cup was carefully placed on the communion table, and the parishioners began to file out of the church. To their surprise, when the parishioners entered the building on Christmas Day, the cup of tea was gone. In its place was a beautifully carved wooden nativity set. Had God replaced the cup of tea with the nativity set to show his pleasure with them? In the rear of the building, hidden from sight, stood Adashari with a big grin on his face. You see, what no one knew was that he was a Chushu in wood carving. And it was he who replaced the teacup with the nativity. walking away from the church, unassuming wondering, what was he ever to do with the key cup he held in his hands?